Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. I'm going to be continuing my series on how Jesus sounds in John today. I wanted to apologize briefly for the scratchy sound on last week's broadcast. I think I've got it worked out, and so I've tested it today, and hopefully the sound will be much clearer and easier to listen to this time. I want to talk today about Johannine style, or Johannine idiom. Johannine, of course, meaning of John. Now, implicitly, we've already been talking about that this entire time, because this entire series is about the attempted argument from how Jesus sounds in John and how he supposedly doesn't sound in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to the idea that John substantially elaborated, put words in Jesus' mouth, put his own interpretations in Jesus' mouth, invented, etc., though different scholars will use different euphemisms for that idea. But that is the semantic content of what they're saying. And today, what I want to do is to zero in very explicitly on what I call the two-step argument from Johannine idiom to Johannine elaboration, okay? So it's a little two-step. So the first part of it is Jesus in John sounds so much like the narrator in John and like the author of the epistle of 1 John, that this raises some kind of question. We're trying to figure out how to explain that. Now, as you'll remember, we refuted an exaggerated version of this that was simply false, which was the statement that it is often impossible to tell in the Gospel of John where Jesus leaves off speaking and the narrator picks up, and there's literally only one time. But there's a broader claim that just in some general sense, Jesus talks like the narrator in John, and Jesus talks like the author of 1 John. Now, there's actually some truth to that, and in that broader sense, not in the sense of it's often difficult to tell, who's speaking. And one reason there's an opportunity for this is because John has written that preface, that in the beginning was the word preface, and also because at certain times he will kind of go into a little bit of his own discussion, even when it is distinguished from Jesus. So I think, for example, that in John 3, John the Baptist's words about Jesus are pretty easy to tell where they stop and the narrator takes over, but the narrator does sort of take over and talk theologically in a way that the synoptic authors just don't choose to do. And scholars, I think, have been misled by this because of their false dilemma between being theological and being historical. A topic for another day. But this also provides an opportunity to catch on to the way that the narrator writes. And also the fact that we have an entire epistle by this same author. So, Luke didn't write any epistles. Matthew and Mark didn't write any epistles, so we have more of a sample. And you do find that insofar as something could be called style, but also themes, and I'll be distinguishing themes and style as we go on. They're not the same thing. But as far as both of those are concerned, there are similarities. A very obvious answer to this, though, and one that I think has a lot to commend it, which I'll be talking about down the line in a later video, is that John thinks and talks like Jesus, not that John makes Jesus think and talk like John. Jesus was a huge influence on John when John was quite young, and we've all seen how students do come to resemble teachers that they admire and that they learn to think like and to speak like. So I think there's a lot of merit to that. But now we get the second part of the two-step. The second part of the two-step is, but Jesus in the Synoptic Gospel sounds so different from Jesus in John. And then you'll even see a phrase which is just not a good phrase. It's 3-1 against. Craig Evans used that phrase in his discussion with me. And given the fact that there's dependence among the synoptics of some degree and some kind, that's just a terrible phrase. But, that he sounds so different. So then the idea is to pit the synoptics in John against one another. And what I've been doing is trying to evaluate this by breaking it down into separate parts. And I started out in the very first video, which in some ways I'm picking up on now, where I left off there, and showed that it just, on the face of it, it's not true, that there's nothing in John, or almost nothing in the synoptics that sounds like John. We've got a lot more resemblance than you might think. But I'm also distinguishing as well as digging. So, for example, last week I distinguished sheer length from what I called a looping or repetitive, very effective speaking style. And what we find when we dig and distinguish is that these claims turn out either to just be false, sometimes because they're exaggerated, sometimes because they just are false, like there aren't 7 I am discourses in John, or they turn out to be true in some form, but not actually to provide an argument against the very robust, very literal historicity of the Gospel of John. So, for example, last week we distinguished between sheer length of Jesus speaking uninterrupted and that looping style. Well, as far as sheer length, Jesus does not speak uninterrupted in John for longer than he does in the Synoptics. Matthew wins the prize there. But as far as that repetitive style, where Jesus will ring the changes on a certain word, we find less of that in the Synoptics. We'll actually hear a few examples that are in the Synoptics, but less of that in the Synoptics than in John, particularly in those longer segments, which are more choppy in the Synoptics than they are in John. But we saw that doesn't in any way call the historicity of either John or the Synoptics into question, because it would be in the interests of making something easy to remember to cut out those repetitions, which could be the goal in the Synoptics, and it could be in the interest of John. He might have desired to represent more literally the way that Jesus spoke, and in a more realistic way, the way that he really sounded with that connective material in there. and so neither of them is anything other than robustly realistic. It's important to remember, I'll be coming back to this, that we don't have the same discourses or segments of lengthy speech reported in both John and the Synoptics. So it's not like we're comparing those next to one another and saying, oh, that's being reported very differently here than there. We don't even have that. They're actually different things. John is supplementing the Synoptics, and that makes a difference as well. All right. Now, what we find in this two-step argument is that you have this huge umbrella phrase, how Jesus sounds, which lumps just, everything in the kitchen sink in there, right? Actual matters of style, themes, length, sayings that are in John that just don't happen to be reported in the Synoptics, like the I am sayings. I mean, it's just like all going in there. You even find, and I wasn't going to mention this in this video, but I can't bring myself to devote an entire video to such an incredibly poor argument, and I want to get it said, so I'm going to put it in here. It doesn't really fit any better anywhere else. You will even find, under this category of how Jesus sounds, scholars try to make something of the fact that you don't find story parables in John, and you do find story parables in the Synoptics. Now, what I mean by a story parable is like a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, "Give me the goods that fall to me," prodigal son, that kind of thing. You find, extended metaphors in John, like I am the true vine and my father's the husbandman, but not a story. There was a man, and this is what happened to him, and so forth. And that literally gets used as some kind of, what do you know? It's very significant to notice, as if the absence of story parables in John somehow calls the robust historicity of John into question. I have even seen in one blog post, Dr. Lacona brought that up, and it's very, interesting, or some term like that, about the absence of parables in John, and then had a reference to a verse. I wasn't going to do this, so I didn't look the reference up, but you can look the reference up in the Synoptics, where it says he spoke to them in parables, and he, without a parable he did not speak to them. I think it's in Matthew, but it might be in both Matthew and Mark. And it's like summarizing a time, a large chunk of Jesus' teaching, and he put that reference in there. And when I responded to this, I said, surely he cannot mean, I certainly hope he doesn't mean, that this is to be literally taken to mean that Jesus never taught the people at all without using a story parable. I mean, it's clearly somewhat of a hyperbole, but also referring to the immediately preceding chapter, which is, this series of parables. So, I mean, that's just, as an argument, that's just awful. John looked back, he saw parables in all the Synoptics. It's very plausible that he knew that, and he's like, those guys have got that covered. I don't need to be telling more story parables. I'm going to use my parchment in a different way. So that even gets lumped in there along with all this other stuff. It's just how Jesus talks, and it's so different in John and the Synoptics as part of this two-step argument. Jesus sounds like the narrator and like the author of 1 John. Oh, you're going to say maybe John sounded like Jesus? Well, but he sounds so different in the Synoptics. So, okay. So I'm breaking this down, and I'm showing that again and again we find that either these statements are false or they are true. But how in the world do you get an argument from that to any question about the very robust historicity of John? So the case of, there are no story parables in John. So what? That's an example of the latter. Now, it's important to note that themes are not style. Themes just are not style at all. You can have someone who talks about the same theme in a different style, okay? Or who uses the same style for a different theme. So those can come apart. Themes and style are not the same, and they should be distinguished. Especially themes, and even that looping style that I was talking about in repetitiveness, are not the same thing as idioms in the stronger sense. So we find this exaggeration, Johannine style and synoptic style occasionally are made analogous to a British and an American accent. And the idea then that comes to one's mind when one hears that is British versus American idioms. I wrote just a few down. There are a lot more, but certain British idioms would be something like the penny dropped. Now, I've never heard an American, a person who's spent all his life in America, use that. Maybe it's used in some regions, but I think that is a British idiom. Or look after the pennies and the pounds will look after themselves. His geese were always swans. That's a British idiom. The idiom under the weather is used in both British and American and Australian usage, but in American idiom it just means feeling ill, whereas in the idiom of other English-speaking countries it means drunk. So the use of under the weather to mean feeling ill would be American. My mates, meaning your friends, okay, or your buddies. So again, friends, buddies is more the American way that you would say that concept, but my mate is the British way that you would do that. There's even a joke in Doctor Who where he says to the Donna Noble character, I just want a mate. And she says, well, you ain't gonna mate with me, buddy. And he says, or you ain't gonna mate with me. And he says, no, mate, I just want a friend. He just wants a friend to travel with him. An American idiom would be take a rain check. Okay? So that analogy is dubious for Johannine style. In fact, what we find is actually a similarity in the reportage of people's speech between John and the Synoptics in things like disambiguation, like Jesus of Nazareth was something that the people of the time would have said because there were so many different people named Jesus. We don't find, and this exaggeration would imply that we do, something like, here's Jesus over in the Synoptics, and he's consistently, over and over again, using actual phrases, like akin to, look after the pennies and the pounds will look after themselves, or take a rain check, that are distinctive to one place and time in the Synoptics, and then consistently using phrases, idioms of that kind that I just gave you examples of between British and American in John that are distinctive and specific to a different place and or a different time, that make him sound like he's, like he came from two completely different places. That's exaggerated. That's much too strong. So between the conflation of style with theme and the exaggeration of the concept of a difference between a Johannine and a synoptic style, we get an appearance or an impression or an implication of some problem that really isn't there. I want to introduce here a phrase that I have coined, and you're welcome to use it elsewhere. If you cite me, try to use it in the same way, and that phrase is a statistical contradiction. So a statistical contradiction would go like this. If I supposedly have a representative sample of the clothing that a person wears and the colors that a person wears in one biography of that person, and I'm always mentioning that he's wearing blue over and over and over again and in all different contexts, and that's supposed to be representative of the colors that he wears. And then I've got another biography covering exactly those same times and similar situations, and it's also supposed to be statistically representative, and there lies the issue, of the colors of clothing that that guy wears, and it's being mentioned over and over again that he's wearing orange, in its shirts both times. Then you could say we have a statistical contradiction because they're both supposed to be representative, but he can't wear, orange shirts 90% of the time, and also in the same kinds of situations wear blue shirts 90% of the time, especially if they're, solid color shirts, okay? So the statistical contradiction idea is the idea that it's unspoken. This is one of those unspoken premises that it's so useful to bring out. But I think you will find that when you read about the way Jesus talks, it's an underlying premise, unspoken premise, that John and the Synoptics are both as if they had a little footnote saying the number of times that Jesus addresses a theme in this book is to be taken as a representative sample of the number of times he represented that theme throughout his entire life, and that he spoke of that theme, or used a word, that count them up, and it's going to be a representative sample of the number of times Jesus used that word. And then as if each of the synoptics had that same footnote, okay? So a word like witness or truth, or which has to do with a theme. If Jesus wants to talk about truth, then he's going to use the word truth, right? So if they had that footnote, that it was supposed to be a random representative sample of the number of times Jesus used all the significant words used in this gospel, then you can create some kind of statistical tension, because even though they're not representing the same discourses, they're not representing the same conversations, dialogues, and so forth. Still, if they're both supposed to be representative and random, and one of them has him saying truth, 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 or witness, 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 way more often than the other one does, now we have a tension. But that's ridiculous. None of the Gospels purport to be giving a representative sample. So, of the number of times Jesus addressed certain themes or used certain words. The statistical contradiction argument, which is one of the arguments that underlies this two-step, he sounds so different from the synoptics, has major problems, major holes. One that I've already mentioned is the fact that there is some degree and some kind of literary dependence between and among the synoptics. Now, you can take different approaches to that, and I also argue that there is some degree of independence, and partial dependence, partial independence. But there is some degree of dependence. So I'm counting, and it's 3-1. It's a terrible way to put it, because as far as the selection of material, we find a huge amount of overlap. And probably this results from the synoptics using one another in some combination or other, and to some extent following that same selection of material. They diverge somewhat in selection as well, but to some extent following that same selection as far as, which discourses to report, which dialogues to report, which miracles to report, and so forth. John is just reporting different material. So without that, without that similarity of reporting the same things, it isn't 3-1. Okay? Obviously, it's not like Luke is randomly selecting his pericopes, as they're called, to report independently of both Mark and Matthew. So that's going to be a problem for this statistical contradiction argument, because they're zeroing in ways that are not independent. It's not like you have all of this, random selection in each of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, plus a random representation of the ways that Jesus addressed themes and the themes he addressed, and then we're finding different statistics. So there's all kinds of problems there. There is nothing whatsoever to prevent the synoptics and John from both presenting robustly, recognizably historical discourses and sayings that are selected from a larger pool of historical discourses and sayings according to their interests. So John is interested in the themes of truth, and Luke is too. I'll get back to that in a minute. Witness especially is an overlap. But John is very interested in truth and witness and the Son's relationship to the Father and so forth, somewhat more so than the Synoptics are. And so he's not trying to randomly select the way that Jesus talked in terms of the topics he was addressing. I was talking about this in an interview I did with one, I don't remember who it was who was interviewing me, and he gave a good example. He said, yeah, in this interview, we haven't had any quotations from the Gospel of Luke. And he said, but that doesn't mean that you never talk about the Gospel of Luke. Okay, we had just been focusing more on, I believe it was the Gospel of John, so that's why we hadn't talked about the Gospel of Luke. So that statistical contradiction, implicit argument is very poor. Of course, picking up on the first video, and I would really encourage you to go back there, we do find overlapping themes. It's just a difference of emphasis and of numbers, of statistics. So witness, for example, comes up in Acts and in Luke. Luke 24, you will be my witnesses, you will be witnesses to these things. That's in both Luke 24 and Acts 1. Peter in Acts 1 says we have to select someone from among us to be a witness. And then John, everybody, the Father bears witness, the Spirit bears witness, John the Baptist bears witness to Jesus. Jesus says, you will be my witnesses because you have been with me from the beginning, which also forms an undesigned coincidence with those words of Peter in Acts 1. So it's much more prevalent in John, but we also find it in Luke. We even find overlaps of style over brief segments. So one that's noticeable, Mark 9:37, and I think I mentioned this one in the first video of this series. He takes a child, puts him in the midst, and says, whoever receives one child like this in my name is receiving me. And whoever receives me is not receiving me, but him who sent me. Notice that linking, even in that short verse, it sounds a bit like what you might call that looping Johannine style. So we have a coming together there of theme and style, very similar to John 13, but in a completely different context. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who receives whomever I send receives me, and he who receives me receives him who sent me. Also in the so-called Johannine Thunderbolt, we have a coming together of that looping style over a brief number of verses with a theme. Okay, I praise thee, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth. This is Matthew 11:25. That thou didst hide these things from the wise and intelligent and didst reveal them to babes. Yes, Father, for thus it was well-pleasing in thy sight. All things have been handed over to me by my Father, and no one knows the Son except the Father, nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son wills to reveal him. So we've got themes there. He who has seen me has seen the Father. Definitely Johannine themes, and also that Johannine ringing the change of style over a few verses. And by the way, since that's supposed to be the creation of a distinctive mind and a very different accent and a different community, what's it doing in Matthew at all? It only takes one, even at that point, to call those exaggerated claims into question. But there is a statistical difference. These themes and that looping style do come up more often in John and over longer periods. But once we get rid of that underlying assumption of representativeness, which there's absolutely no reason to grant, then we see that there's no argument here. And we also have to get rid of that idea of literally conflicting idiom sets, as if in one, Jesus were using very distinctively, Galilean idioms, and in the other, he were using very distinctively idioms and phrases that sound like someone from Alexandria or something like that, similar to, the same guy saying, look after the pennies and the pounds will look after themselves, and then turning around and saying, hey, I'll take a rain check. We would say that's that's a failure. Like if you saw that in a movie, you would say it was a failure of diction. It was a failure to give that character a consistent diction. But we don't find that kind of literally conflicting regional idioms and like literal whole idiomatic phrases that would be conflicting regions in them. So what we have here is a combination of exaggeration and to the point of falsehood, of giving a false impression, and faulty unspoken premises of representativeness, which means that the things that are true concerning Jesus using certain themes and styles more in one than the other do not lead to any sort of questioning of the robust historicity and recognizable historicity of both. I think that probably next week I'm going to do a discussion, hopefully shorter than some of these have been, of specifically the phrase eternal life and the question of whether John systematically replaced a phrase like kingdom of heaven with the phrase eternal life. And you can get a sort of a preview of where I'm probably going to go with that from my discussion here of representativeness and from the fact that the same sayings are not being reported in the different Gospels anyway. It's between John and the Synoptics. But I'll give you a better discussion of that next time and just give that its own video, because sometimes that gets used. Well, look here, John is going through as if John said, oh, don't want him to say kingdom of heaven, I'm going to make him say eternal life instead. And I think that's highly questionable. So I hope you'll stay with me here, because this is really getting into some pretty detailed stuff. But I think it can be very helpful to evaluate these claims so that you don't just get sort of swept up in that Johannine two-step argument against the robust reliability and accuracy and historicity of the Gospel of John. Thanks for watching. I'm Lydia McGrew.